Hi, my name is Pittampalli, and welcome to the 12-Minute Leadership Series. Today we have a great topic, which is how to pay attention to boring presentations. Now, this is just a fact of organizational life. I mean, we can avoid boring presentations as much as we want, or we can try to. And by the way, I advocate that. I mean, the first step, whenever you're faced with a boring presentation, whether it be a meeting that has has a boring content, or a training presentation, or conference call, the first question you have to ask yourself is, why am I even attending? Because if it's so boring, it's a signal that maybe you don't need this information. Maybe there's a way you can get out of it. But unfortunately, the reality is, no matter how much we try to avoid these kinds of presentations, we just have to. It's a part of organizational life. So today's presentation is all about how to make the most out of this, because sometimes the information contained in these presentations is critical. And too often, we don't even know how critical it is until after the presentation is over, and we realize, my God, I should have paid attention to that. And so that can be a problem. So what I want to do today is give you 8 tips on how to improve your attention during these presentations, how to boost your how to boost concentration, how to basically survive these presentations, but not just survive them, thrive them by taking out some of the most important information from these presentations. Some of these are obvious, some of these are not so obvious, but they're all very important. So pay attention right now. And by the way, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to answer questions. So if you have any questions as we go through, just type them into the little box, and I'll get to them right after after the presentation. Okay, so let's start out with tip number 1. Tip number 1 is fidget. I know, it sounds really strange, but it turns out that fidgeting, which seemed like a strange behavior, there's actually a growing body of fascinating research that shows that fidgeting has a purpose, which is it improves alertness. So a lot of this research comes out of the ADHD world, right? Because for a long time they thought that young kids that were fidgeting in class who had ADHD, interrupting, kind of moving their body, getting up out of their chair, they thought that was problematic. But it turns out that might very well be one of the things that's actually making them pay attention. And so the conventional wisdom was to stop that behavior, and now it's to try to find productive ways to encourage fidgeting. So obviously in an organization, we have to use appropriate kinds of fidgeting, right? So doodling on a piece of paper, shaking your leg, or tapping your finger or your pen. These kinds of, it seems silly or it seems trivial, but it turns out that these kinds of just tiny behaviors, because you're moving your body, is actually going to help increase your alertness. So try it and see if it works for you. Okay, tip number 2, have a goal. Now, every good presentation should already have a goal for you, right? When I have a presentation, I have a purpose behind it. I'm trying to convince you of something. I'm trying to share something with you, a very specific thing. The problem is some presentations aren't very good, and they might not do a good job of communicating what that goal is. So what you have to do is you have to fill in the blank. You have to create your own goal. So one of the easiest things to kind of have as a goal is identify the top 3 takeaways from this presentation. That's your goal, okay? Instead of being a passive listener, now you're active, and the brain does much better when it has a focus, something to kind of grab onto, a very specific mission. And so what you do is you take your piece of paper, number 1, 2, 3, and the whole purpose of you being in that room is to try to identify what are the top 3 takeaways from this presentation. And so if you achieve that goal, you're in pretty good shape, because you may have not gotten everything, but you've gotten the most important stuff. And just that action will help you boost your concentration. Okay, tip number 3, eat a snack. Now again, this seems really obvious, but the amount of research just in the last decade or two that has shown that our blood sugar is very much associated with our level of concentration is pretty extraordinary. So there's a researcher named Lee Gibson, who's out of Roehampton University, who has actually estimated that it's 25 grams of glucose, which is the optimal level of blood sugar, or sugar in the blood, the brain needs in order to sustain kind of optimal cognitive function. So that's like the size of a small banana. So these, like having a small banana or some kind of snack available to you that you can eat during the meeting or before the meeting might go a real long way in helping you pay attention. Okay, the number 4 tip is exercise. Now again, this is kind of an obvious one, but I want to tell you specifically why exercise works, because a lot of people understand the long-term benefits of exercise, right? We know that over time, exercise has great impact on our physical abilities and our mental abilities. But there's actually a short-term impact as well. So why exercise improves short-term ability is because it increases oxygen to the brain. And what we know is that an increase of oxygen to the bloodstream and the brain improves mental alertness. So what you want to do is you want to try, if you want to take advantage of exercise in the short term, is you want to try to exercise close to the presentation, right? So let's say an hour or a half an hour before the presentation, get moving, right? Like walk up a flight of stairs for a couple minutes or take a long walk. The more vigorous the activity, the better, but it doesn't take incredibly vigorous activity to get the short-term benefits of mental alertness. So make sure you exercise. Okay, number 5, reduce stress. Unsurprisingly, stress limits your ability to pay attention. So if you are currently stressed right now, for example, it's going to be harder for you to pay attention. Not only is it hard to pay attention, during a boring presentation in general, but if you're stressed out, you're actually hindering your ability to pay attention even more. So we got to deal with this stress thing. There's lots of ways to deal with stress, and that's not the topic of this presentation. We could do an entire presentation on that. But one simple way that has proven time and time again to work really well for people is deep breathing. If you take really long, deep, diaphragmatic breaths, that will help you relieve stress. Okay, so do it for a period of 5 minutes, for example, right before the meeting or the presentation, and that will help you diffuse some of that stress and will put you in a better state of mind to be able to listen to this presentation. Okay, number 6, eliminate distractions. So if you are, one of the things that happens during a boring presentation is you get distracted, obviously. That's one of the problems. But if you go into the presentation already being distracted, this is going to be a big problem. So the most obvious example of this when it comes to physical distractions is the classic conference call when you're working on your computer or trying to do email and listening to the conference call at the same time. That is woefully misguided. I mean, a lot of people have fooled themselves into thinking that they can really do both at the same time. What you're probably doing is you're probably severely reducing your ability to do both, right? So neither are you really paying attention to that conference call, and you're probably not doing a good job of answering your email. Now, you may be an exception. There are some people that just have this superhuman ability to do that, but I want to challenge your assumption that you're one of those people, because you probably aren't based on the numbers. So what you want to do is you want to eliminate those distractions. Decide on whether you're going to attend this conference call or you're going to check email. If you think this is a presentation that's worth paying attention to, then put away the email. But those are just the physical distractions. What I'm talking about here is not just the physical distractions, but the mental distractions. Sometimes when we go into a presentation, we're thinking about completely other things, right? We're thinking about taking our kids to school the next day or something like that, or taking out the trash, or an email that we need to send at some point, or another meeting later in the day. Like, these are things that what David Allen would call are open loops. When you have open loops, which are these kind of distractions that never get closed, your brain constantly brings them to your attention. This is happening in the background, but it's severely limiting your ability to pay attention because it's taking up so much cognitive bandwidth. So here's the recommendation. This is a very important and useful recommendation. Before going into a meeting, if you find yourself being distracted, write down specifically everything that is on your mind. Just do a thought dump onto a piece of paper. Write it all down. And then also write down, this is the critical part, write down a time and place in which you will address those thoughts. Okay? Because your brain is not going to want to let those go unless you you basically ask its permission to revisit it later, and it takes you seriously, right? So you have to actually commit to another time and a date to go over those thoughts. And this is actually, by the way, a very good tool to help with insomnia right before you go to bed. But if you do this, then you will be your brain will give it a rest, or at least it'll do a better job of giving it a rest. So that way your brain is clear and you can focus on the attention on the presentation. Okay, tip number 7. This is kind of a last resort measure, which is take a break. Now, this may seem counterintuitive because the last thing you want to do if you want to pay attention is to leave the room, because then you can't pay any attention. But think about it this way. If you are so impaired in your ability to pay attention, like this presentation is so incredibly boring that it is impossible for you to stay awake, well, it might be useful to just take a short break, because you're not getting anything out of the presentation anyway. So if, for example, it's a 60-minute presentation and 20 minutes in, you just really are having a challenge concentrating, take a break. If it's appropriate, leave the room, take a walk so you get so you get a little bit of exercise in there as well. Take a walk for 2 minutes, then come back, and you will be refreshed and you'll be able to pay attention better now. Those 2 minutes, you may have lost those 2 minutes, but you will far make up for it by the boost in concentration you will get for the rest of the presentation. So again, this is a last resort scenario. It's not, you don't want to do it because obviously it's often distracting to the presenter. It's just bad decorum. But in the last resort, if you really can't pay attention, use that as a tactic. Okay, and the final tip, number 8, which I think is the most powerful tool you can to improve your concentration, but it's a little bit of a long-term play, is meditate. The amount of the number of studies in the growing body of research that suggests that meditation improves concentration is now overwhelming. I mean, it just gets better and better in favor of meditation. It's so crucial, I think, now as a competitive advantage for leaders to be able to improve their attention span by meditating. I mean, I used to have the attention span of a hummingbird, and by meditating pretty much every day for the past 2 years, although I've fallen off every now and then, my attention span is way better. Now, this is not something that gets short-term results. It's probably going to take a little bit of time, but meditation really pays dividends. I know a lot of people on this call probably have thought about it and have maybe never actually committed to it because you didn't have the time or the energy, but if you need an excuse, now is an excuse, because I'm telling you how crucial it is to boosting your attention. And here's a little pro tip. A lot of people find it very hard to meditate by themselves just by staying silent, but one of the things you can do is just get a guided meditation, like a little audio track that actually guides you through the meditation. I used to think this was cheating. It's one of the reasons I never did it, but all of the studies, or a lot of the studies, actually use guided meditation when administering the study, and it actually works extremely well. So that's my tip for you. Okay, so those are the 8 tips for how to improve attention, how to pay attention to boring presentations. Right now, if you have any questions, put them in the box. I want to answer them. For those of you who signed up for the 12-minute webinar, go ahead and sign off right now. Good luck. For those of you who want to stay on for this additional Q&A, let me see if there are any questions to answer. Okay, so Hillary has a great question, which is, which tips do we apply during the presentation and which are most useful prior to the presentation? Often you don't know how boring a presentation is going to be until you're in it. So are there ways to adapt the long term in the moment? That's a really good question. So as you can tell, some of these tips are going to work really well before the presentation, some of them during. So fidgeting, for example, is something you can do during the presentation. Having a goal is something you can do shortly after realizing that this person is not clearly articulating what the point of this presentation is. That's actually kind of one of the biggest signals, right? Like if you're watching a presentation and the first 5 minutes you have no sense of what the goal of this presentation is, what the takeaways are going to be, what the objectives are, you are kind of headed probably for a boring presentation. Because even if the presenter is dynamic and exciting, we're not very good at just aimlessly following along anything. We like to have a roadmap. And so unless you're watching, for example, Game of Thrones, in which case you probably don't need a roadmap, but that's not what we're talking about here. So that is probably the biggest signal. In the first 2 or 3 minutes, if you find that the person is not really clear on the objectives, that's when you want to start thinking about applying some of these tactics. So again, you can, some of the other ones that apply are eliminating distractions, right? If you find yourself being distracted during the actual presentation itself, this is when you can scribble onto a piece of paper what you're being distracted by. In fact, one tip is to have a notepad with you during the entire presentation. And every time you get distracted, because you're probably going to get distracted multiple times, write down what you're distracted by, and that can help a lot. And then finally, taking a break is the last resort that you're going to want to do during the presentation. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions here. Anything, Andrew asks, anything that a participant can do to help a facilitator make a meeting more interactive? Potentially a future webinar. Well, thanks, Andrew. Maybe I will do a future webinar on this. This is a tough question because I don't think there's much you can do. I mean, there's something you can do before the presentation, right? So, for example, if there is a certain person who is, chronically has meetings that are boring, that are not interactive, that are too long, I think it's your obligation as a leader in an organization to do something to give that person feedback, right? Because the reality is a lot of times people don't get feedback and they don't know that they're really bad at these presentations. Everybody thinks they're good at presentations. It's like one of those things. It's like, it's like those statistics that 90% of college professors think that they're above average college professors, which is mathematically impossible, right? It's the same thing when it comes to presentations. It's the same thing when it comes to meetings. So your best bet is to try to give that person feedback beforehand. Once it's during the presentation, presentations is a tough thing. It's a really formidable thing for people. They're probably anxious to begin with. It's a hard thing to do to try to negotiate how they're presenting in the moment. So it's kind of too late. So I would say that your best bet is to try to approach them before or after, so that way next time they'll be better. Anyway, great questions, guys. Thank you so much for attending. Next week, we're going to have another webinar, and I hope it's not a boring presentation. There will be a survey at the end of this webinar, so please let me know if you got something out of this. And I like honest feedback, so please tell me if this particular webinar was better or worse than past webinars, if there's something I can improve, because I really value that feedback. I'll see you next time.